Hey everyone, Cool Kid here. A whopping 4.5 years ago now, I released my second actual video, the status tier list. In the years since that video's release, a lot has changed, so I've decided that half a decade is probably enough time for me to take another crack at the concept. It's definitely not because Sci-Fi Freak has kidnapped my family and demanded I make this. Now, I know this probably seems unnecessary, but I do think it's important for me to establish what a tier list actually is. Simply put, it is a list of various tiers, with things higher on the list being better than the things below them. My goal with this video is to both explain how each status effect works in detail, as well as explain why I think they are placed either high or low on the list. Before we get into the actual tier list though, I want to get some things out of the way. First up, this video is just my opinion based on how I play the game. I've done my best to evaluate things as fairly as I can, but this list is still by no means objective. Different status effects are better or worse than others depending on the situation, and playstyle is a significant factor in how valuable you'll find any given status effect. I also want to make it clear that I'm not trying to say that any given status effect is bad or that you shouldn't use it. If you like something that I put low on the tier list, then don't let me stop you from having fun. Okay, with that out of the way, let's establish some ground rules. Rule number 1, the tiers are not ordered. This means that status effects in the same tier are not being compared to each other, only status effects in other tiers. So, for example, a status effect in A tier is just A tier, not high A tier or low A tier. Rule number 2, this video is only going to cover player-to-enemy interactions, not enemy-to-player. Rule number 3, railjack status effects are being excluded from this list, as they work totally differently than their terrestrial counterparts. I'd say that a future railjack status tier list is on the table, but I don't think anybody really cares, to be honest. Rule number 4, this video will only cover status effects tied to a damage type, and damage types with no status effects will not be tiered either. So, for example, Lifted will not be on this list because it isn't tied to a damage type, and True Damage won't be tiered because it has no status effect. Rule number 5, the placement of a status will not be affected by what you can or cannot run alongside it. So, for example, I'm not going to knock Toxin down in placement because it can't normally be run with viral damage. Likewise, I'm not going to bump up Electric because it can be used alongside viral damage. I will note if a particular status effect is easy to access, like Magnetic for example, but accessibility will also not influence tier placement. Rule number 6, tier placement will not be influenced by external mods or items that affect a given status. For example, Electric will not have its placement affected by Influence, Radiation won't be affected by Irradiate, Impact won't be affected by Internal Bleeding or Shattering Impact, and so on. This also includes Archon shards, so Corrosive and Toxin won't be affected by green shards, Heat and Blast won't be affected by orange shards, you get the idea. I understand that the actual gameplay of Warframe isn't isolated, so I will bring up certain item combos and synergies when relevant, but they won't impact the way status effects are placed on this list. My goal is to evaluate these effects as is, which is why this rule exists. Alright, with all of that out of the way, I want to explain 3 concepts that are crucial to understanding this video: damage, status effects, and faction matchups. If you already understand these ideas, then feel free to jump ahead to the timestamp on screen. Still here? Alright, let's get into it. Damage in Warframe is made up of a combination of damage types, which are broadly categorized as either elemental damage or physical damage. Elemental damage consists of the 4 primary elements, which can be combined in various orders to produce the 6 combo elements. Combining primary elements will create secondary elements going from top to bottom and left to right in the modding screen, so keep that in mind. Pivoting a bit, physical damage is made up of impact, puncture, and slash damage, often called IPS for short. The vast majority of weapons have some or all of these damage types built in, and physical damage mods are quite different from elemental mods. While elemental mods add a percentage of the weapon's modded base damage back on as their respective element, physical mods increase the existing amount of a physical damage type by the listed percentage. As such, physical damage mods are much weaker than elemental ones in terms of raw power, which makes building around physical damage a bit difficult. Unless you're the Coda Motivore, I guess. The main thing I want you to take away from the topic of damage is this: the vast majority of damage is comprised of multiple individual damage types. This knowledge is crucial for our next 2 topics, status effects and faction matchups. So, status effects are debuffs that can be applied to enemies when they receive damage. Each damage type has its own corresponding status effect, with the exception of true damage. Status effects of the same type can be stacked multiple times, usually up to 10, with each stack having its own duration. To elaborate, if I inflict a corrosive proc, which has a duration of 8 seconds, and then inflict another corrosive proc 4 seconds later, then the first proc will expire independently of the second. Also, as a quick note, the word proc refers to an individual stack of a status effect when used as a noun, and when used as a verb, it means inflicting a given status effect. So, this magnetic status is one magnetic proc, and the gun I use to inflict it has the ability to proc magnetic. The first stack of any given status effect is usually the strongest, with subsequent stacks inflicting the same debuff at a reduced effectiveness. If you reach the maximum number of procs for a given status effect, then any new procs will replace the oldest proc of the same type. The chance to inflict any status effect is determined by your weapon's status chance. Do keep in mind that, like critical hits, status chance is rolled separately for each hit of multi-shot. Status chance can also exceed 100%, in which case the hit will always inflict one status, with any amount over 100% being an additional chance to inflict a second status. This scales like you'd expect, with 200% being 2 status effects with a chance at a third, 300% being 3 status effects with a chance at a fourth, and so on. So status chance is the total chance you have of inflicting any status effect, but the odds of you inflicting a specific status effect is determined by a mechanic called status weighting. Essentially, the more of a damage type you have on your weapon, the higher the chance of inflicting that specific status. If you want a more detailed breakdown, you can hover over the status chance stat in the arsenal, which shows you the exact odds of inflicting any individual status effect on hit. The placement for damage types on this tier list was pretty much entirely based on the status effect they inflict, but I do have one more concept I want to explain: faction matchups. Back before Jade Shadows released, we had a system called health classes, but nowadays this has been streamlined into simple faction matchups. Simply put, any given faction will be weak to 2 damage types, which increases the damage they take from those damage types by 50%. Factions can also be resistant to a damage type, which reduces the damage they take from that damage type by 50% instead. Keep in mind that any given attack is normally made up of multiple damage types, so these resistances and vulnerabilities will only affect a portion of the attack's damage. For example, say I have a weapon that deals 30 damage per shot, which consists of 10 impact, 10 puncture, and 10 slash damage. If I shoot an infested charger, then the slash damage is increased by 50%, adding on 5 damage for a new total damage of 35. These faction matchups are very rarely a deal breaker when it comes to selecting a certain damage type, but playing into a faction's weaknesses is often very helpful. I mean, a bump in damage is a bump in damage. Okay, with all of that boilerplate out of the way, let's get into the tier list itself. I do also want to note real quick that things might be kinda confusing early on. As tier lists are tools for comparison, it can be a little difficult to understand things before you have the whole picture. I'll do my best to explain things as we go, and ideally everything should make sense by the end, so if I draw any connections that don't quite make sense out of the gate, then give it some time. Our first tier down at the bottom of the list is rather niche. This tier is for status effects that serve a very specific purpose, only really finding value in some select situations. This tier also has another unifying element. All of the status effects in this tier can actually work against you if you aren't careful. To kick off this tier, we've got Impact. Impact is one of the 3 physical damage types, and it has a positive matchup against the Grineer, Kuva Grineer, Skaldra, and Anarch factions. Honestly, this matchup chart is really good, and Impact has the most positive matchups of any damage type in the game. Impact's status effect is called Stagger, and it does 2 different things. Firstly, it raises the target's mercy threshold by 8% per proc, up to 40% at its cap of 5 procs, with each proc having a 6-second duration. Yeah, Impact is one of the rare status effects that has a 5 proc cap instead of 10. This means that, for most enemies who can be mercy killed, they'll have the threshold raised from 40% of their HP to 80%. I have noticed that many non-Eximus units have very low mercy thresholds as well, with things like heavy gunners, bombards, and ancients having a threshold closer to 20%. Impact can raise this threshold to 60%, which makes mercy kills much easier to take advantage of on these units. Hey y'all, Editing Cool Kid here. After releasing the first draft of this video, LEU pointed out that mercy kills are even weirder than I had realized. In short, heavy units have a base mercy threshold of 40%, and Eximus units have a base threshold of 80%, but this threshold actually goes down with level. For every 5 levels over level 150, the threshold decreases by 1% of the enemy's maximum health, down to a minimum of 10%. This doesn't matter much in most regular Steel Path missions, but content like Endurance runs, Netra cells, and especially Elite Archimedia all suffer because of this. Alright, that's all I had to say. Back to the original script. Impact's secondary effect is that, each time a proc is inflicted, the enemy will stagger. This stagger's duration increases for each impact proc on the enemy up to the maximum of 5 stacks. So then, Impact serves a pretty obvious niche. It's useful for triggering Parazon mods and getting rid of Eximus units. That is absolutely a mechanic you can build around, but I honestly don't think that it's super helpful to do so. Eximus units are tanky, sure, but killing them with your regular weapons is often just as fast as using a mercy finisher, if not faster. Parazon mods are also pretty niche in and of themselves, and while they are absolutely useful, it's often not necessarily something you'd want to tailor your whole build around. I also think it's worth noting that, if an impact proc expires, then you can have your mercy finisher taken away. This leaves you in front of a powerful enemy who suddenly can't be insta-killed anymore and is probably about to make you pass tense. This isn't even mentioning the fact that many enemies can't be mercy killed in the first place, which means that Impact's most useful effect doesn't do anything a lot of the time. Now, in fairness, a lot of weapons do force impact procs on hit, which makes the mercy effect much easier to take advantage of. Thing is, that neglects the second and much bigger issue with impact. The stagger that this status effect inflicts is really annoying at times, and it can make headshots much more difficult. If I'm trying to shoot an enemy in the head and he keeps busting it down sexual style, then I'm gonna have a rough time, even if he is goated with the sauce. Because each new proc of impact re-triggers the stagger, enemies will flinch constantly, jerking their head back and forth like I do in stage defense. They can even break into a full-on cha-cha slide, which is a headache to deal with if you've got any kind of precision weapon. I know this might seem like a minor thing, but headshots deal 3 times normal damage on most weapons, with crit headshots dealing an additional 2 times damage on top of that. Not hitting an enemy in the head is a huge loss in DPS, and this status effect actively makes it much harder. Sure, Impact can be used in some setups centered around Parazon mods, but I don't think it's unfair to say that such a playstyle is pretty niche. If you're not actively seeking out and scooping up every mercy kill you can, then Impact only provides its stagger, which isn't terrible crowd control, but the increased headshot difficulty can easily make it a damage loss in the long term. Next up, we have Radiation. Radiation deals bonus damage to the Murmur and Sentient factions, but reduced damage against the Anarch and Orican factions. Radiation's status effect is called Confusion, which causes enemies to attack and be attacked by allies for a whopping 12 seconds. The first stack of Radiation also causes enemies to deal 100% more damage to their allies, with an additional 50% per stack, up to a cap of 550% more damage at 10 stacks. Some enemies, such as Kuvaliches and Acolytes, won't attack nearby allies when affected by a Radiation proc. Instead, the procs will increase the amount of damage they take from allies, starting at 100% and going up to 250% at 4 stacks. Now, this status effect actually has some really powerful crowd control uses. Enemies attacking each other normally means they aren't attacking you or any objectives you might be defending. Enemies are also unable to grant buffs to or receive buffs from their allies while confused, which is super helpful. As an example, the Ancient Protector can't give Overguard to a confused ally, and if the Protector itself is confused, then it can't grant Overguard to anyone. Even though overguarded enemies can't be confused with Radiation directly, they will still attack nearby allies who have the effect, so it kinda works on them regardless. So this status effect is quite good for crowd control, but it does have its issues. For one, enemies will still attack the player if they're close, so it isn't exactly that consistent. On top of that, enemies aggroing onto their allies means that a lot more damage is being slung back and forth, and very erratically at that. Enemies who weren't previously close enough to attack the player can be brought in by irradiated allies attacking them, which makes things even more chaotic. This can result in stray bullets from enemies who previously weren't a threat hitting you, which is especially harmful if you're invisible. Taking radiation on, say, Loki for example, is basically just asking to be blown up by a stray bombard rocket that never would have been fired if you left them alone in the first place. This can also cause some Eximus abilities, namely Arson and Blitz attacks, to be deployed at unpredictable times, which can lead to an unexpected death. The other thing that works against radiation is that enemies don't deal very much damage relative to how much health they have. Even the maximum 550% damage boost to allies doesn't really translate to any fatal gunfights at higher levels. This means that, while you can certainly distract enemies, the resulting chaos isn't really a threat to anybody but you. If you keep your distance, then you'll probably be safe, but most of this game's tile sets are close quarters, which regularly means that's not an option. The last footnote I want to make about radiation is that, simply put, it doesn't really help you kill things. Most status effects give you some kind of offensive boost, but radiation is more or less pure CC, which is kind of a bummer. Radiation can absolutely be a powerful crowd control tool if you know how to use it, but it has a long list of considerations attached. You might take a stray rocket, or a stray arson fire blast, or any other number of unexpected attacks, all while affected enemies rarely take enough damage to even dent their health. Later status effects like Cold are more consistent and have offensive tack-ons that make them more useful than the chaos and confusion that radiation provides. This playstyle can be a lot of fun if you know what you're getting into, but it's difficult to justify building for otherwise. Our last status effect in this tier is Void, which is very unique among damage types. Unlike most of the other damage types in the game, Void is neither an element nor physical damage, instead fitting into the rare category of Sinister Third Thing. As a result, Void has no faction damage matchups except for Zeraman, which only contains the Thrax and Void Angels. It also deals 50% more damage to Overguard, so that's cool, I guess? It's important to note that Void damage can't be modded for, instead being accessed by either an Amp or the Zata's Whisper ability. Astral Bond also allows companions to deal Void damage, but that's more of a footnote than anything. Void damage has a lot of effects when it comes from an operator, but for the purposes of this video, I'll be considering those effects as operator damage. I know some people may consider that unfair, but as Void damage from non-operator sources doesn't have these effects, I do think it's fair to section set effects off from the status as a whole. So, that leaves Void with the Bullet Attractor status effect, which only has one stack, with new stacks just refreshing the timer. This status spawns a 2.5 meter bubble for 3 seconds, and any projectiles or hit scan attacks that enter the bubble will be redirected towards its center. The center of the bubble is determined by the hit that procced it, so if the Void status was triggered with a headshot, then the bubble's center will be on the enemy's head, and if the Void status was triggered with a leg shot, then the bubble will center on the enemy's leg. Not only does this bubble pull in the player's shots, but enemies will have their shots wrangled by it too. This means that any unit trapped inside the bubble won't be able to attack with ranged weaponry, as it will simply redirect the attack back into them. As one final thing, Void damage also resets sentient resistances on hit, which is kinda nice. Now, this status effect isn't all that bad, but it has a major downside that I'm sure you've already noticed. Because the bubble centers based on the hit that spawned it, then bad aim can make all subsequent damage target a suboptimal spot. For example, if you just so happen to spawn a Void bubble on the enemy's arm, then getting headshots will be much more difficult. You can still kind of curve your shots if you shoot the bubble at the right angle, but in this scenario, the Void status effect has only made your life harder. At that point, the only thing you can really do is stop attacking the affected enemy until the Void status expires. Now, I'm not trying to doubt the godly gamer abilities of my audience, but not every shot is going to be a headshot, and if your luck isn't great, then you might end up with none of your shots being headshots for a short duration. Using Astral Bond can honestly make this even worse, as Sentinels and the like can actively troll you if they inflict a Void proc that isn't targeting the head. I know I said earlier that I wasn't going to consider any modding limitations when talking about a status effect, but I do think it's important to bring up with Void. Unlike almost every other status effect, Void can only be accessed with Amps, Astral Bond, and Zatas, which is very limiting. Amps are by no means bad these days, especially after the release of the old piece, but there isn't really any reason to mod them for status chance because crit is just so much better on them. As for Zata's Whisper, it's very good, absolutely, but that means you're still sacrificing a whole Warframe ability to use Void. I don't want to knock Zata's, as it is a phenomenal ability, but that's largely because of its crazy scaling, not because it's Void damage. And the Sentient Resistance removal? Sentients are wet paper these days, and it's fairly uncommon to encounter them in large quantities. Overall, Void damage is difficult to access, provides a somewhat mediocre bonus, and poor placement can result in it actively working against you for its duration. Like everything else in this tier, it absolutely can be the center of some cool setups, but you have to be aware of the potential drawbacks. Honestly, if you want a bullet attractor, then I'd recommend Scourge, super underrated utility weapon. For our next tier, we have Kinda Weak, which is pretty self-explanatory. The status effects in this tier aren't outright bad, and unlike the ones below them, they don't run the risk of harming the player, but they just aren't all that strong. First up in this tier, we have what is quite possibly the greatest fall-off since the original corrosive nerf, Slash. Slash deals increased damage to the Infested and Narmer factions, which is cool, I guess? Slash's status effect is Bleed, which is our first damage over time status, so I'd like to take a quick detour to explain how those work. So, a damage over time effect, or DOT for short, is a status effect that, well, deals damage over time. DOTs come in two flavors: single-target DOTs, which only affect the enemy they're applied to, and multi-target DOTs, which deal damage in a radius around the enemy. DOT effects deal 1 tick of damage every second. Those single-target DOTs deal their first tick of damage after a 1-second delay, while multi-target DOTs deal their first tick of damage instantly. DOTs are also exceptions to the normal 10 stat cap, with all DOTs having no cap on their stat count aside from gas. When it comes to calculating the damage a DOT will deal per tick, the game first calculates the hit's modded base damage, which is the weapon's base damage after things like base damage mods and faction damage mods are considered. After the modded base damage is calculated, the game runs it through another formula, which first cuts it in half before multiplying it by things like status damage mods, mods that match the damage type of the DOT, and faction damage mods again. Note that faction damage mods are used twice in this calculation, so if you've ever heard that DOTs double dip with faction damage, this is how that works. There's also another section of the formula for additional multipliers, which contains things like critical hits, headshots, stuff like that. This may seem kind of obvious, but DOTs also generally deal the same damage type as their corresponding element. So, for example, a toxin proc will deal toxin damage, a heat proc will deal heat damage, and so on. There is one exception to this though, which brings us back to Slash. So, when a Slash proc triggers, it deals 1 tick of damage every second for 6 seconds. This damage isn't actually Slash damage though, instead being cinematic damage, which ignores armor. The ability to ignore armor outright is quite good, but Slash's math suffers quite a bit for it. For starters, instead of multiplying the modded base damage by 0.5, the formula for Slash is instead 0.35, which is a sizable loss in damage. On top of that, Slash procs don't consider matching damage type bonuses in their DOT calculations, so Slash mods don't boost the damage of any Slash procs. This leads to a proc that deals low damage up front, but its ability to ignore armor is what gives it an edge. Now, back when I made my first status tier list, Slash was a top tier element. In those days, enemy armor could reach 98% damage reduction or more on the steel path, which was a 50 times effective health multiplier or better. Armor strips were also much rarer and much worse, so Slash was the only real option for dealing with heavily armored targets. Fast forward to 2022, and Veilbreaker is released, which massively overhauls armor stripping abilities, making them much more powerful. Fast forward again to 2023, and the introduction of Emerald Archon shards makes fully removing armor on any frame easy with Corrosive. Fast forward again to 2024, and Jade Shadows massively changes the armor system, capping enemies at 90% damage reduction, which is achieved at 2700 armor. Armored enemies were given more HP to compensate, meaning that they now have less damage reduction, but more health overall. Why is this relevant? Well, back in the day, Slash was so good because armored targets had a lot of armor and a bit of health, so ignoring their armor outright was incredibly efficient. Now though, enemy armor isn't nearly as much of an enemy's total effective health, so ignoring it outright isn't as useful. On top of that, enemies have much more actual health, so it takes Slash considerably longer to kill them as it has to chew through more HP than before. And on top of that, removing armor is very easy these days, and in that circumstance, Slash doesn't really have much going for it. Add all of these factors to its lackluster DOT math, and Slash just struggles a lot these days. There is an important reason I don't have it in the bottom tier though. It still deals damage. Sure, it isn't great damage, but it's still more damage. Unlike the stuff in the rather niche tier, Slash doesn't harm you in any way, it's just not really worth building around anymore. If you're gonna go for a DOT-focused setup, then pretty much every other DOT is better, and that's not because Slash got nerfed, but rather because the game has evolved past the point of it being necessary. Rest in peace, viral HM meta. I still find old builds that use you sometimes. I imagine this is going to be kind of contentious, but our next status effect for this tier is Puncture. Puncture deals additional damage to the Corpus and Orican factions, and its status effect is called Weakened. Weakened does two different things. First, and most obviously, it reduces enemy damage by 40% for 10 seconds. Subsequent stacks of Puncture reduce enemy damage by a further 10% per stack, up to a maximum of 80% at 5 stacks. Technically, you can get to 7 stacks of Puncture with Evensong, which makes enemies deal no damage, but that's such a specific mechanic that it's more of a footnote than anything. The second thing that Weaken does is increase the crit chance of any hit that is applied to an enemy. This crit chance boost is 5% per stack, up to a maximum of 25% at 5 stacks, and it's considered a final bonus. This means that the crit chance bonus is added on top of your existing crit chance independently of other modifiers. So, for example, if I have 20% crit chance and I hit an enemy with 5 puncture procs, I'll have 45% crit chance. If I then put on critical delay for 60% crit chance, my hits on the weakened enemy will have a crit chance of 85%, as the puncture procs bonus is flat. This is also how things like Covenant, Arcane Avenger, and Cat's Eye work, and while the game usually calls this type of buff a final bonus, you may hear the term flat from community members. So, Puncture reduces enemy damage, increases critical chance, and has a low stack cap, which makes maxing it out very easy. These are all really good things, but personally, I don't think they're good enough to incentivize building into Puncture. To explain why I think this, let's take a look at the two effects individually. Reducing enemy damage is useful in some contexts, absolutely, but it's rarely necessary. Many Warframes survive via shield gating, which is total invincibility, and invisibility is also a pretty common survival tactic. Crowd control effects also make the reduced damage pretty irrelevant, as CC'd enemies can't really fight back in the first place. We can also stack so many kinds of damage reduction that a lot of hits can be outright tanked until very high levels. Again, the effect is by no means bad, it just isn't that impactful. Next up is the crit chance boost, which again is good, but not so much so that I'd invest into Puncture. A flat 25% bump in critical chance is solid, but we have so many ways to build crit chance these days that I don't think it's anything crazy. On top of that, 25% isn't really a huge buff by itself, and while it might be enough to push you into a new crit tier, I think it's more of a nice to have than a game changer. Puncture's crit chance bonus also doesn't affect AoE attacks or Warframe abilities, which isn't really the end of the world, but it does limit its usefulness somewhat. Much like Slash, I'm never sad to see a Puncture proc, but I'm not really gonna build around it either. The crit chance bump is decent, the reduced damage is decent, and the low stat cap is kinda nice, but none of that stuff is so good that it'll get me to invest in Puncture stocks. I do think this could be argued up a tier, but I don't personally think it's quite that good. This tier list isn't ordered like I said earlier, but if it was, then Puncture would be at the top of this tier. For our final status in this tier, we have one that didn't even exist when I made my first video, Tau. Tau damage did exist back then, but the Tau status didn't, though that did not stop people from commenting that I should have tiered it, as if that made any sense. Tau is an interesting damage type for a lot of reasons, but the first I want to highlight is that it has no matchup chart at all. Like Void, Tau isn't an elemental or physical damage type, also fitting into the designation of Sinister Third Thing. The second interesting thing is that it's very rare, as there are no mods that grant the damage type. In fact, the only way to inflict the Tau status are Caliban's abilities and the Venado Prime, which has a unique trait that applies a Tau status whenever it inflicts any other status effect. So, what does the Tau status actually do? Well, it applies a debuff called Status Vulnerability, which increases the odds of inflicting a status effect on enemies by 10% per stack. Each stack has a duration of 8 seconds, and it caps out at 10 stacks for 100% status vulnerability. I've seen some people say that Tau also increases status damage, but as far as I've tested, that doesn't seem to be the case. I've also done some testing to see how this buff is handled, and as far as I can tell, the bonus is multiplicative with status chance mods. So then, attacking an enemy with 10 Tau stacks is basically doubling your final status chance. Like everything else in this tier, that's not bad, but it's nothing crazy either. Status chance is another plentiful stat, with 60/60 mods making it especially easy to access. It's not a bad thing to have more of, and weapons with a high base status chance can take very good advantage of the boost, but it doesn't feel super impactful either. Like Void damage, I do think that Tau's inaccessibility should be addressed. Only a single Warframe can inflict it naturally, and most of Caliban's abilities don't inflict it in very high quantities. Razor Gyre and Ortholist salvos are your best shot at getting to 10 stacks of Tau, which is especially rough. Because Tau's status vulnerability is 10% per stack, only having a few stacks isn't all that helpful. This is in contrast to most status effects which front-load their bonus on the first stack and grant reduced effectiveness on subsequent stacks. Tau's linear scaling makes low stack counts less useful, and because most of Caliban's abilities don't apply that many Tau stacks, you're normally going to see it in low quantities. Outside of Caliban, the only way you're going to land this status effect is Venado Prime. It is remarkably accessible on Venado, and I think its gimmick is actually quite good, but that's a single weapon in the entire game that can really leverage the mechanic. It's obvious that DE wants to keep Tau exclusive, as can be seen with Sentient Wrath's Helminth form not inflicting it. Its bonus isn't something that I'm ever annoyed to see, sure, but it's not really that good either. Add that to the slow stacking and general inaccessibility, and Tau is just, well, kinda weak. Also, I didn't write this in the script, but it doesn't work on forced procs, so that's good to know. Our next tier is pretty solid, which is for status effects that are good, but often have specific use cases that limit their usefulness. Our first status effect in this tier is one of the game's most bizarre, Gas. Gas damage boasts a positive matchup against the Tekrot and Deimos Infested, along with a negative matchup against the Skuldra. Gas's status effect is Gas Cloud, which leaves a lingering DOT that inflicts damage in a 3-meter radius for 6 seconds. Gas is our first multi-target DOT, meaning that it can hit multiple enemies, but there's a lot more interesting stuff to it than that. First up, Gas is the only DOT that has a stack cap of 10. This means that any stacks applied after this cap will replace the oldest stack, which can result in a loss of damage if you land body shots or non-crits. Interestingly enough though, the radius of the inflicted Gas Cloud increases with each subsequent proc, increasing by 0.3 meters up to a maximum of 6 meters at 10 stacks. This means that you'll want to get to 10 procs if possible, but going past that point is often unhelpful, which is really peculiar for a DOT. The low stat cap hurts Gas a lot, as one of the main advantages of other DOT effects is their unlimited stat count, which lets them ramp their damage. Because Gas is capped at 10 though, rapid-fire weapons are effectively out of the equation. Gas procs also have another weird quirk. You remember how I said that DOTs look for matching elemental mods when calculating their damage? Well, gas is made up of toxin and heat mods, but it's looking for gas mods, so it doesn't scale with its constituent elementals. Only leaded gas and valence formation count as gas mods for this part of the formula, which makes gas procs lose out on a lot of damage. To get the most out of gas, you'll want to invest into things like base damage, critical chance, critical damage, status damage, and aim labs. With all of these limiting factors, you're probably wondering why gas is so high on this list. Well, that's because it has some unique benefits that make it very strong in the right context. Firstly, gas is a multi-target DOT, so it can turn normally single-target weapons into area damage weapons. Multi-targets also have an interesting property I didn't mention earlier. They can attack body parts. You see, single-target DOTs deal damage directly to an enemy's health, but because multi-target DOTs have to hit nearby enemies, they can actually target specific body parts. This means that, in addition to the damage boost a headshot would normally grant a gas proc, the resulting gas cloud can score headshots itself. There is a major caveat to this, though. The gas cloud has a 1x headshot multiplier by default, though this can be boosted with things like primary deadhead, target acquired, and certain sniper zoom bonuses. This property of multi-target DOTs also allows them to attack weak points from abilities like sonar and detect vulnerability, which is admittedly niche but undeniably helpful. Gas being a multi-target DOT also means that it can cause somewhat of a chain reaction. If you inflict multiple enemies with gas procs and they're all near each other, then they'll take damage from both their own gas proc and the gas procs of nearby enemies, which rapidly scales the damage. That said, I do think it's important to highlight that enemies can simply move away from each other after they take a gas proc, so you can lose out on this damage sharing without some kind of external grouping. The last thing that makes gas so powerful is that it has an on-death effect. You see, most status effects don't do anything special if an enemy affected by them dies, but gas is one of only 2 exceptions. When an enemy dies with a gas cloud on them, the cloud doesn't go away, but instead lingers where the enemy died for its remaining duration. This makes gas a very strong area control tool, as it can deal high damage for several seconds after the target has expired. Gas is also a huge beneficiary of a somewhat obscure mechanic. If a target dies to a hit that would have inflicted gas, then the cloud is still spawned even though the enemy was killed. So, gas has a pretty low stat cap and it doesn't scale great, but in exchange it leaves a lingering AoE that's capable of headshotting. Gas is an interesting status effect because, while it's by no means bad overall, it is bad on a lot of things. Rapid-fire weapons don't find much value in gas for one, which cuts a lot of the roster out of the equation. Where gas really excels is on weapons that hit hard and have high status chance, like the Vectis Prime, Daiku Prime, and Paris Prime, especially with its Incarnon. If you hit an enemy in the face, then the resulting gas cloud can deal a lot of damage to nearby enemies, and the lingering effect makes it great for controlling choke points. Melee weapons are also very good with gas, even though they aren't great at the whole headshot thing. You can use light attacks to stack up procs for the range bonus before unleashing a heavy attack that will serve as the bulk of the cloud's damage. Heavy slams are also very good for this, though you can't really stack up the weaker procs as easily with that strategy. Now, I know I said I wouldn't change the tier of a status effect because of external items, and I swear I'm not about to do that. Even so, I feel like I have to point out just how good Melee Afflictions is for gas. Gas damage really excels when you have very specific control over your proc count, as you want to get as close to 10 procs as possible without spilling over. Affliction's ability to net you 7 gas procs instantly is very useful for this, especially when combined with heavy attacks that force a knockdown, like those on scythes and dual daggers. Heavy slams are also incredibly powerful with afflictions, which is noteworthy. Again, I swear I'm not using afflictions to justify putting gas this high, I just think it's a valuable interaction that should be pointed out. I know this has been a lot, so to summarize my thoughts, gas isn't good on that many things, but the stuff it is good on, it is really good on those things. Sure, it doesn't scale with its constituent elemental mods, doesn't have an uncapped stack count, and doesn't have great range without 10 stacks, but it makes up for these failings with its radial, lingering damage and ability to chain react. Even though this status effect is rather niche, I can't deny that it kicks some serious ass when used correctly, which is why it's this high up. Next up, we've got another placement that I expect to be contentious, Corrosive. Corrosive damage is strong against the Grineer, Kuva Grineer, and Skuldra factions, but deals reduced damage against the Sentients. Corrosive's status effect is called Corrosion, go figure, which reduces enemy armor for 8 seconds. The first Corrosive stack will remove 26% of the enemy's armor, with subsequent stacks removing 6% armor up to a cap of 80% armor removal at 10 stacks. This armor strip is also multiplicative with other forms of armor stripping, like heat procs and the Corrosive Projection aura. So if you, for example, had a heat proc that removed 50% of an enemy's armor, and then you applied 10 Corrosive stacks, you'd end up with 90% armor reduction in total. At a glance, you'd probably expect Corrosive to be underwhelming for many of the same reasons as Slash. Armor isn't as much of an enemy's EHP anymore, armor stripping has become easier, stuff like that. But I do think Corrosive still holds its own, as being able to reduce enemy armor independent of abilities is still quite strong. At the Steel Path level, pretty much all armored enemies have 2700 armor, which gives them a 10 times effective health multiplier. At 10 stacks of Corrosive, this is reduced to just over a 2 times effective health multiplier, resulting in a 6 times increase in damage. This is in contrast to Corrosive's main competition, Viral, which yields a 4.25 times damage increase. So against armored targets, Corrosive is actually better than Viral. It is worth mentioning that at 1 stack, Viral nets a bigger damage boost, but at 10 stacks, it goes handily to Corrosive. Unlike Slash, Corrosive also boosts all damage that an armored enemy takes, as opposed to bleed procs that deal damage by themselves. This means that non-corrosive damage on the weapon will deal more damage to the target, as will non-Slash DOTs and even Warframe abilities. Now, while Corrosive is still definitely good, I can't act like the criticisms of it don't exist. Removing armor is far from mandatory these days, and armor strips are just much more accessible now. A 6 times damage increase from Corrosive is great, sure, but if an enemy has no armor, then it doesn't do anything. This doesn't just mean that enemies who have no armor naturally don't care about Corrosive procs, but enemies who have their armor removed by external means also don't care about Corrosive procs. If you're playing a frame like Frost, Necros, or Styanax, then you probably won't get much value out of this status effect. Real quick, I want to acknowledge the existence of Emerald Archon shards. These increase the maximum stat count of Corrosive by 2 per shard, or 3 per shard if Tau Forged. This means that you can remove 92% of enemy armor with 1 regular shard, 98% with 1 Tau Forged shard, or 100% with 2 regular shards. I find that 1 Tau Forged green is typically enough, as the remaining armor leaves enemies with a roughly 1.15 times EHP multiplier, which isn't really enough for me to care. If Archon shards are in play, then Corrosive easily goes up a tier, as it results in a nearly 10 times damage boost in that context. The thing is, I said I wasn't going to consider external bonuses for placements on this tier list, and that has to include green shards. Even without green shards, I still think this status effect holds its own. It grants a sizable damage boost over Viral on armored targets when both are at 10 stacks, and it even lasts for 2 more seconds. Even with that considered though, I can't deny that it has its problems. Armor isn't as oppressive as it used to be, other forms of armor stripping can render it useless, and unarmored targets could not care less that it exists. Still, having a form of armor removal that's independent of abilities is really helpful, which is why it finds itself in this tier. Our last status effect in this tier is an anti-Corpus classic, Toxin. Toxin damage's only positive matchup is against the Narmer faction, but that's hardly interesting compared to its main gimmick. You see, Toxin damage outright ignores the vast majority of shields, dealing its damage directly to the enemy's health pool. Some enemies have shields that block this effect, but for the most part, Toxin will not give a shit. Because this effect is unique to the damage type itself, not the status effect, all Toxin damage will slip past shields even if its status isn't inflicted. Toxin's status effect is Poison, which is a generic single-target DOT that inflicts Toxin damage every second for 6 seconds. Unlike the last 2 DOTs we've talked about thus far, it actually does scale with mods that match its element, those being Toxin mods. This status effect is very effective against shielded targets, but I don't really think I can place it higher, and I want to explain why. Toxin ignores shields, yes, but only the Toxin damage ignores shields, leaving the remainder of your damage behind. This means that killing an enemy before you break their shields is often unlikely, leaving Toxin as more of a target softener than an outright killer. That isn't some great crime or anything, but I do think it's worth pointing out. Shields are also not a huge amount of an enemy's EHP most of the time, with it typically being about a 60-40 split between shields and health. This means that bypassing shields is helpful, but oftentimes it's not really needed. Toxin also caught a huge nerf in Jade Shadows, which I don't see people talk about much. You see, before Jade Shadows changed the game over to the faction matchup system, Toxin had a 50% damage boost against the Flesh health type. This health type was used by humanoid Corpus enemies, meaning that Toxin procs got a 50% damage boost for free. Nowadays though, Toxin only gets a boost against Narmer, so it lost a whopping 50% of its damage against the faction that it was most useful against. Add on the fact that Magnetic, its main competition, was hugely buffed in Jade Shadows, and Toxin just isn't as good as it used to be. I will say that, like Corrosive, I want to at least acknowledge Emerald Archon shards. These shards grant 30% more damage to Toxin procs, or 45% if Tau Forged, which is additive with status damage mods. This results in a huge bump in damage that allows Toxin procs to pack an insane punch, making them one of the highest raw damage DOTs in the game. The thing is, much like Corrosive, I'm not considering shards when it comes to placement, so Toxin lives as a comfortable mid-tier. Now, I don't want to give off the impression that Toxin isn't good. It absolutely is. It just isn't all that needed. Toxin is still a strong option against shielded targets, but it deals significantly less damage than it did in the past and has strong competition in Magnetic. The fact that only Toxin damage goes through the shields is also a limiting factor, as that often leads to the majority of your damage being left behind. I'll never complain about getting a Toxin proc, because, again, it's more damage, regardless of whether or not the enemy has shields. The problem is that the niche it serves just isn't super necessary, and these days it's outperformed by Magnetic. Moving up to our next tier, we have Really Good. At this point, I have very little bad to say about these damage types, so let's dive right in with our first status, Electric. Electric damage boasts a very impressive matchup chart, with positive matchups against the Anarch, Murmur, and Corpus Amalgam factions. You heard that right, Electric has 3 positive matchups and no losing matchups, which is pretty surprising for an elemental damage type. Electric's status effect is called Tesla Coil, which does 2 different things. Firstly, Electric is our second multi-target DOT, dealing its damage in a 3-meter radius around the target for 6 seconds. Being a multi-target DOT, it has many of the same upsides as Gas. It deals its first damage tick instantly, can target body parts, causes enemies to share damage with each other, all that good stuff. Do note that, like Gas, the radial damage of an Electric proc has a 1x headshot multiplier, but it can still be boosted by stuff like Deadhead, Target Acquired, and certain Sniper Zoom bonuses. Electric does have a significantly smaller radius than Gas at 3 meters, which does suck, but in exchange it has a massive upgrade. Electric has no stack cap. This makes Electric immune to the main issue that Gas damage contends with, as no cap expands its accessibility to rapid-fire weapons. Electric's secondary effect is that, when an enemy is inflicted with an Electric proc, they'll be stunned briefly. This stun lasts for about 3 seconds, though it does vary slightly depending on the enemy hit. Do note that this stun duration is not prolonged by status duration mods, and the stun cannot be refreshed by applying a new Electric proc until the current stun animation is finished. This stun can also be outright ignored by several enemy attacks, such as melee slams, as their animations override the electrostimulation. Still, this crowd control gives Electric another useful effect on top of its already very strong DOT. Enemies who are stunned can't move, which makes them easier to land additional shots on, and they also can't fight back, removing them as a threat until they regain control of their nervous system. The stun's ability to lock enemies in place also means that targets moving away from each other is much less of a concern than Gas, though do note that only targets with Electric procs will be stunned. Like I said earlier, this status effect has very few drawbacks. It has a great matchup chart, has no stack cap, it stuns enemies, it can target heads, it's very good. Honestly, I think the main issue with Electric is just the low radius of the area damage, but similar to Gas, using an external grouping tool like the Sciatid can help with that. Electric also kind of struggles against armor, at least in comparison to something like Heat, but after Jade Shadows, it isn't nearly as big of an issue as it used to be. In short, Electric is very good for both its radial DOT and stun effect, and it can be made even better by bringing grouping tools or an assload of headshot damage. Next up, we've got Cold, which is surprisingly complex. As for the faction matchups, Cold is strong against sentient enemies, but weak against the Tech Rot. Cold's status effect is Freeze, which slows enemy movement, attack speed, fire rate, and even gravity by 50% on the first stack. This slow increases by 5% for every additional stack, up to a maximum of 90% at 9 stacks, and each stack lasts for 6 seconds. Cold also has the additional effect of increasing critical damage by a flat 0.1 on the first stack, increasing by 0.05 on subsequent stacks up to a cap of 0.5 at 9 stacks. This crit damage bonus doesn't affect AoE weapons, and as it's a flat buff, it doesn't scale with any mods, but the extra damage is always nice. Now, you might have noticed that all my prior numbers were maxing out at 9 stacks, but Cold's stat cap is still the normal 10. What's up with that? Well, at 10 stacks, Cold has a unique behavior. Instead of slowing enemies, it outright freezes them for 3 seconds. Frozen enemies can't move, can't attack, can't recharge their shields, and have a flat +1 critical multiplier boost applied to them. After the 3-second freeze duration, enemies will break out with 3 cold procs remaining. Interestingly, unlike almost every other status effect, applying new stacks of cold to an enemy at 10 cold procs won't replace the oldest procs on the enemy. Instead, frozen enemies cannot gain new stacks of the cold status until they've broken free. Cold is such a useful status effect, in part because it works on a ton of stuff that is normally immune to crowd control. You can apply up to 4 stacks of cold on overguarded enemies, even loads of bosses, which slows them down by 65%. This makes their attacks more telegraphed, their fire rate much lower, and the movement speed reduction makes them way easier to shoot. Cold's CC abilities are remarkably good in general, as enemies under its effects become much easier to deal with. Staggers from other sources are also prolonged by this status effect because cold just slows down time for those affected by it. This means that cold can be used in combination with other CC effects to massively prolong their duration. The freeze mechanic is also very interesting, as you get a short moment of hard CC before the enemy breaks out. The critical damage boost is also nice, but it's small enough that I don't think it's game-changing. For me, the ability to slow almost any enemy to a crawl is remarkably valuable. Boss attacks become more telegraphed, Eximus units are easier to react to, the DPS of any affected enemy is massively reduced, they become much easier to track and shoot, it's all great. Sure, the crit damage buff isn't that high, and it doesn't work on AoE weapons, but having such a powerful and reliable form of CC is fantastic. While cold doesn't deal much upfront damage, its plentiful utility makes it an incredibly good status effect. For our last member of the really good tier, we've got Magnetic. Magnetic has a great faction matchup chart, being strong against the Corpus, Corpus Amalgam, and Techrot factions while only losing out against Narmer. Magnetic's status effect is Disrupt, which increases damage dealt to enemy shields and Overguard by 100% for 6 seconds, with subsequent stacks increasing the damage by 25% up to a maximum of 325% at 10 stacks. Magnetic also slows down the natural shield recharge rate of affected enemies, but things like Shield Ospreys can bypass this. Magnetic is already very good up front as an anti-Eximus status effect, but it has an additional mechanic that makes it even better. Whenever an enemy's shield or overguard breaks and they have a magnetic proc, then a forced electric proc is applied. This proc deals 3% of the target's maximum shields or overguard as damage per magnetic status, up to 30% of the max shields or overguard at 10 stacks. This means that not only is the target instantly crowd controlled upon their shield or overguard breaking, but both the amount of magnetic procs and the total value of their defenses scale the damage. This is remarkably powerful, and I've seen this electric proc all but insta-kill Eximus units. While the damage bonus against shields is nice, it isn't really what makes Magnetic great. Shields aren't that hard to deal with, and enemies who have them are generally fairly squishy. The anti-overguard element of Magnetic, however, is incredibly useful. Not only do you deal more damage to Overguard, which makes enemies CC vulnerable sooner, but the electric proc that Magnetic applies crowd controls the target as soon as you possibly can. This helps to prevent Eximus units from casting their abilities on top of chunking their health, which makes them much less of a threat. Now, in a vacuum, Magnetic is already quite good, but I think it gets better or worse depending on the content you take it into. In a normal Steel Path mission, the Eximus spawn cap is 2 at a time for a solo player, so if you're in, say, a typical survival fisher, then its value is somewhat limited. In high-level content though, Magnetic is borderline mandatory these days. DE has added a disgusting amount of Overguard to basically everything after Jade Shadows, and Magnetic has become a crucial part of dealing with that spam. Both types of Archimedias contain a ton of Eximus units, on top of the bolstered Belligerence modifier giving everyone Overguard when it appears in a mission. Hulvania has boosted Eximus spawns out of the gate, and Face Off has debuffs that increase the Overguard presence even further. Most recently, the Descendia mode has floors with Eximus Cabals, where 90% of the enemies are Eximus units. In these environments, Magnetic is a godsend, and taking it is pretty much a must. While I don't want to alter Magnetic's placement based on its acquisition, I do think it's important to highlight that the Magnetic mods from Hulvania also provide great secondary stats. This means that taking Magnetic is very easy most of the time, because its corresponding mod likely has a stat that you want anyways. Adversary weapons can also use Magnetic as a progenitor element, which makes it even easier to access. Again, I'm not using this as justification to put it this high, I just think it's worth pointing out. To be honest, I think you could argue that Magnetic is S tier. It provides a damage boost against one of the most powerful enemy defensive mechanics in the entire game, and the electric proc it inflicts both crowd controls affected targets and deals a lot of damage to them. For me though, Magnetic is barely not S tier for one simple reason. It doesn't do anything on targets who don't have shields or overguard, and that's a lot of enemies. I think that Magnetic is conditionally S tier, as certain content borderline requires it, while other content won't notice its absence much. Still, Magnetic is rarely a bad option, and between its effectiveness and accessibility, I strongly recommend it. I also want to take a moment to deny any allegations that I dropped Magnetic down a tier so that each tier would have 3 status effects. That is totally untrue. But like, come on, it does look good, right? Finally, we've made it to our top tier, Almost Busted. Funny, that's the same thing people were saying when Marie got revealed. This tier is for status effects that are so good they're borderline overpowered, and the first one we'll be looking at to prove such is Heat. Heat's faction chart is pretty simple, dealing bonus damage to the infested and losing out against the Kuva Grineer. Heat's status effect, Ignite, does 3 different things, so let's look at each of them one by one. Firstly, Heat is a single target DOT, dealing 1 tick of damage every second for 6 seconds after being inflicted. The stacks are uncapped like you'd expect, but Heat has another mechanic that's both unique and extremely powerful. For every other status effect we've covered thus far, stacks have had their own duration, inflicting damage and decaying separately. Heat bucks this trend though, as all of the stacks combine into one damage instance. On top of this, adding a new instance of Heat not only increases the damage of the tick, but it also refreshes the 6-second duration of all existing Heat stacks. This lets Heat scale incredibly well, as while other DOTs will often hit a ceiling where they decay at the same rate they're being applied, Heat will just keep going until the target dies. Or if it hits the 16-bit integer limit of 65,535, which causes an overflow. Heat's second property is Panic, which causes enemies to flail for a short time after igniting. This locks them in place and prevents them from attacking for a short duration, which varies slightly depending on the type of enemy ignited. It's about 4 seconds for humanoids, 3 seconds for the majority of infested units, and 2 seconds for MOAs and chargers. Okay, real talk though, have these idiots never heard of Stop, Drop, and Roll? Regardless, the Panic effect prevents enemies from moving or attacking during its duration, and like Electric, it can only be refreshed once the previous Panic has ended. Panic can also be outright ignored by certain enemy animations just like Electric Stun, so keep that in mind. Heat's third and final effect is its armor removal, which is pretty interesting. When an enemy is ignited by a Heat proc, they'll lose armor over the course of 2 seconds. Each half second after the proc, they'll lose a set amount, that being 15% on the first tick, 30% on the second, 40% on the third, and 50% on the fourth. This means that, after the full 2 seconds, enemies under the effect of a Heat proc will have their armor halved, which is a big bump in damage. Strangely enough, status duration mods actually increase the space between intervals, so enemy armor will be removed more slowly the more status duration you have. Inversely, reduced status duration will actually speed up the armor reduction, though that's probably not worth the reduction in DOT duration. Once the Heat proc expires, enemies will slowly regain their armor, working backwards from the normal reduction but at 1.5 second intervals instead. This armor strip is multiplicative with other armor strips, so if you combine it with, say, Corrosive's 80% removal, then the resulting total armor removal will be 90%. So between an almost infinitely stacking DOT, a stun effect, and armor removal, Heat is already incredibly good. It's a top tier element with these traits alone in my opinion, but there's one final mechanic that pushes it firmly into S tier. I know many of you probably saw this coming, but after 5 years on YouTube, I finally have to explain Heat Inherit. This topic is kind of a buzzword in the Warframe community, so I want to do my best to explain it clearly, as it really isn't that complicated. So, because Heat procs combine to form one massive damage instance, you may have thought to yourself, what happens if I combine Heat procs from multiple sources? Well, the math for that is a little different than you'd expect. So, to explain what I mean, let's pull up the Heat DOT formula. This is what's used for the first instance of Heat applied to an enemy. Modded base damage, cut in half, then multiplied by faction mods, elemental bonuses, status damage mods, and so on. If you apply a Heat proc from a second source, however, then the math changes a bit. We still get our modded base damage calculation, but instead of using the faction and heat mods present on the current weapon, the new proc will inherit the faction and heat mods of the original hit. So, for example, if I inflict a Heat proc from a pistol with primed Heated Charge and primed Bane of Grineer, then the formula looks like this. If I then swap to a primary with no heat or faction mods and inflict a new Heat proc, the modded base damage will still be calculated, as will things like critical hits, body part multipliers, and status damage bonuses, but the faction and heat damage bonuses will not be re-rolled. Instead, the bonuses from primed Heated Charge and the primed Bane mod will be used when calculating the damage of this new stack, even though the primary I used doesn't have any heat or Bane mods. If you're wondering how I'm inflicting a Heat proc with no heat mods, just pretend I'm using Ignis or something. This property of heat damage allows for incredibly powerful setups involving a priming weapon and a damage weapon. You can use a weapon like, say, the Coda Tysis to stack huge amounts of heat and faction damage before switching to another weapon to benefit from those bonuses. This is especially effective when secondaries are the priming weapon because of primed Heated Charge, which is a massive heat damage bonus. There is an important thing to consider when playing around this mechanic though. The first stack is used for the faction and heat bonus amounts, so if your first stack has no faction or heat bonuses, then no new stacks can have them either. This makes frames like Ember and Uriel surprisingly bad for Heat Inherit, as their abilities will often apply the first stack of heat, which gimps all further stacks as they'll have no faction or heat damage bonuses. Still, even with this limitation, Heat Inherit is an incredibly powerful way to use heat, allowing for monstrous heat stacks that deal incredibly high damage. Also, as a sort of footnote, new heat procs will inherit the status duration of the initial proc as well. This isn't crazy useful, as heat can very easily be maintained by applying new stacks, but I thought it should be noted. I do want to say though, that I think Heat Inherit is generally not needed to deal good damage with heat. It's super powerful, absolutely, but heat is still incredibly good without focusing on Inherit. If you're doing a level cap disruption or something, then leveraging the strength of Heat Inherit is very valuable, but for most of the game, it isn't needed. Heat has so much going for it that, even without Heat Inherit, I still think it's an S tier status. It stuns enemies it hits, reduces their armor by 50%, and has a DOT that stacks incredibly high because of its unique consolidation mechanic. There is virtually no circumstance in which heat is a bad option, and all of its unique quirks add up to one of the best status effects in the entire game. For our next status, we have what is probably the craziest glow-up of any Warframe damage type, Blast. Back when I made the first status tier list, Blast was easily the worst element in the entire game. Now though, I think it makes a genuine argument for the best, and I want to explain why. In terms of faction matchups, Blast is very simple, having a positive matchup against the Deimos infested and a losing matchup against Corpus Amalgam enemies. Blast's status effect is called Detonate, which, similarly to Cold, has wildly different properties depending on the stack count. Let's start with the sub-10 stack properties first. So, after inflicting a blast proc, nothing will happen for 1.5 seconds. After that time has passed, however, then the blast proc will explode, dealing 30% of the weapon's base damage to the target. I'll show the formula on screen now, which looks pretty similar to the DOT formula. This formula does share a lot of noteworthy traits, like double dipping with faction mods, counting crits and headshots, benefiting from status damage mods, stuff like that. The main difference, however, is that Blast does not scale with any elemental mods. This means that not only do cold and heat mods not increase the damage of Blast, but augments like Valence Formation and Thermal Transfer also do not increase the damage of Blast. When it comes to modding for Blast, increasing the amount present on the weapon is mostly useful for increasing the proc weighting, not actually dealing more proc damage. For that, you'll want to invest in the same stuff as Gas: base damage, critical chance, critical damage, status chance, and aim labs. Okay, low-key, this program kinda sucks. So, Blast procs deal 30% of the weapon's base damage to the target after a 1.5 second delay. That's pretty simple, but once we reach 10 stacks, then things change considerably. If you're able to apply 10 stacks before any of the existing stacks reach their 1.5 second expiry time, then all existing stacks will detonate, dealing their damage in a 5 meter radius around the target. On top of this, the math changes for each proc, causing them to deal 300% base damage instead of 30%. So basically, if you reach 10 stacks of Blast, then not only do all stacks explode in a 5 meter radius, but they deal 10 times the damage as well. This 5 meter radius also has no damage fall off, on top of staggering enemies caught in its radius. It gets even better though, as reaching 10 stacks isn't the only way to cause a detonation. If an enemy dies with any blast procs present, then those procs will also detonate, causing the same 300% base damage hit in a 5 meter AoE. Like Gas, enemies who are killed by a hit that procs Blast will still detonate as well, so one-shotting an enemy doesn't override the explosion. This means that both rapid-fire and hard-hitting weapons benefit greatly from Blast, turning almost any weapon into an AoE powerhouse. While Blast is pretty underwhelming normally, detonations make this status effect absolutely nuts. Because Blast procs consider additional modifiers like crits and headshots, weapons like the Daiku Prime can hit huge detonations via crit headshots. Bows and sniper rifles in general are great with Blast, as it allows them to turn their incredibly high single target damage into incredibly high area damage. Blast also has a 5 meter radius during a detonation, which is only 1 meter less than a fully stacked up Gas. I'm not saying that Blast makes Gas irrelevant or anything, but because you don't need to stack up the radius, you can take advantage of its full range much easier. Rapid-fire weapons are also extremely good with Blast, as they can spam detonations for tons of area damage and stagger. Beam weapons are a great use case for Blast, as are fully automatic rifles, flamethrowers, and really anything that inflicts a lot of hits very fast. Funnily enough though, shotguns can struggle with Blast, as the individual pellet damage is often pretty low. This means that, even though they can easily score detonations, said detonations often don't deal a ton of damage. This is not necessarily the case for all shotguns, but I do still think it's worth pointing out. Also, while this isn't the reason Blast is top tier, I do want to highlight an interaction that it has with Zata's Whisper. Whenever Blast triggers a detonation, Zata's Whisper will be triggered again based on the proc's damage. This Zata's hit will scale with elemental mods placed on the weapon even though the Blast proc itself doesn't, and it will also consider faction damage mods again, effectively triple dipping with them. While Blast is S tier even without this interaction, it does have a lot of damage potential, which is why I'm highlighting it here. To be honest, Blast only really struggles if you can't hit 10 stacks fast enough, and you're not killing the target. There are certainly weapons that have that problem, sure, but it's not a lot of them. In effect, Blast lets you load any weapon with nuclear rounds, and it's awesome. I never thought I'd be fishing Blast out of the trash can to put it in S tier, but I am very glad to stand corrected. Arriving at our last status effect for this list, we have the returning champion, Viral. This status effect has been S tier ever since Warframe Revised came out, and while it certainly has more competition these days, it's still incredible. Looking at Viral's matchup chart, it's actually quite bad, with losing matchups against the Murmur and Deimos infested, but a winning matchup against the Orokin. Viral's status effect is called Virus, which causes enemies to take 100% more health damage on the first stack. Subsequent stacks increase this damage boost by 25% per stack, up to a maximum of 325% more health damage at 10 stacks, and each stack lasts for 6 seconds. In a way, you can kind of think of this like a magnetic for health instead of shields. So, Viral grants you a 4.25 times damage boost at 10 stacks, and even with only one stack, it still grants a 2 times damage boost. This makes Viral incredibly effective regardless of the stack count, as even just one proc doubles your damage. This damage boost also works on pretty much everything. Weapon hits deal more damage, DOTs deal more damage, Warframe abilities deal more damage. As long as you're hitting the enemy's health, you're dealing more damage. This effect is pretty simple up front, but a lot of things make Viral a cut above the rest, so let's explain them one by one. I do think it's important to acknowledge that Corrosive and Magnetic are generally better against armored and shielded targets respectively. The main advantage of Viral, however, is that it always works, while Corrosive and Magnetic don't. If you inflict a Corrosive proc on an unarmored target, it doesn't do anything, and if you inflict a Magnetic proc on an unshielded target with no overguard, then it does nothing. But Viral is always helpful. If an enemy has no health, then they're dead, which is kinda the end goal. Everything has health, so Viral's boost to health damage is always useful so long as it can be triggered. There are a handful of enemies that are immune to Viral's debuff though, and I'll go ahead and show them all on screen now. This immunity generally applies to Deimos infested, so Corrosive is almost always better there, but that's the main special case. The second big advantage Viral has over Corrosive and Magnetic is that it doesn't get stomped on like they do. Corrosive doesn't do much for you if you're stripping armor with Terrify, and Magnetic isn't going to help much if you're removing shields with Strike. Viral though, if an enemy is hit with a damage amplification ability, it doesn't override Viral's effect, but instead they multiply together. Take, for example, Nova's Molecular Prime, which causes enemies to take a flat 2 times increase in damage. If combined with 10 stacks of Viral, enemies will take a whopping 8.5 times more damage instead of one of the debuffs being overwritten. Now, in fairness, Magnetic and Corrosive still benefit from damage amplification as well. The point I'm trying to make is that abilities and effects that serve the same role as Viral don't overwrite it, whereas Magnetic and Corrosive can have their roles taken from them. So, to sum up my thoughts, Viral is an incredibly good status effect because it's almost always useful. Everything has health, so dealing more damage to that health is helpful 99% of the time. It boosts damage from almost all sources, including weapon hits, DOT effects, and even Warframe abilities, on top of multiplying its bonus with other damage vulnerability buffs like Blazing Chakram and Molecular Prime. I will say that I don't think Viral is mandatory like it used to be, and more specialized setups are often more effective. The thing is, Viral is always incredibly helpful, and its strong debuff on top of its widespread usefulness place it firmly in top tier. Alright, that's it for the tier list. I'll go ahead and show the full thing on screen now for those of you who want to see it. If you just skipped right to this part of the video, I've got 2 things to say to you. 1, hello, thanks for stopping by. 2, you better not argue with me in the comments if you didn't even listen to what I had to say. Speaking of, for those of you who have heard my arguments, what do you think about this list? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, just please be civil about it. I also want to reiterate that my goal isn't to tell you that you can't use certain status effects. Different playstyles and situations promote or discourage the use of different status effects, and this tier list is ultimately just my opinion based on how I play the game. If you enjoy wacky setups that spread a ton of radiation or stun lock enemies with impact, then don't let me impede your fun. Also, as one last thing to note, I don't doubt that DE will continue to update these damage types in the future. If that happens, go ahead and check the pinned comment down below for any updates. Beyond that, thank you very much if you made it to the end of this video. The goal was for this to be education disguised as tier slop, so I hope you learned something. I also hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you've made it this far, give me a chalky share in the comments to let me know you're a real one. While we're here, feel free to like, sub, join the Discord, watch the streams, all that nonsense. Most of you have clicked off by now, so it doesn't really matter what I say at this point. I do want to give a huge thank you to my channel members though, whose names you've been seeing on screen. Videos like this would not be possible without their help, so seriously, thank you. With all that out of the way, Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you all next time. So can I have my family back now?
Nah.
God damn it.